In this video, I'm going to be focusing on priming effects. So first, I'll start off with the definition, then explain to you what you're seeing on the screen. For priming effects, by focusing on certain issues and attributes, news coverage can affect the way we evaluate political leaders, political parties, and other things. Well, we have certain methods that we use in order to try and evaluate and understand the way the media affects people's political preferences. And one of the things that we frequently do is we use experiments. For those of you who are going to transfer to a four-year university, you may find yourself in a psychology class having to volunteer to participate in surveys or things like that. This is how we do a lot of the research on the media. So I want to describe a particular experiment to you to get to this question of priming effects. What this group of researchers did is they recruited 500 students, and they created two sets of news reports that looked very similar but not identical. And so they were going to have one group of students watch one report and another group watch the other report. Now, when they had the list of students, they randomly assigned them to either group 1 or group 2. And we do random assignment in hopes that group 1 and group 2 are going to be similar in their attributes. So when they recruited everybody for this experiment, what they told the students is they said, there's the one thing we need you to do. Just don't watch the evening news the night before you come in to participate in this survey. And they were told it was a survey, but really it was an experiment. But oftentimes you have to lie to subjects in your experiments, or they try and guess what the experiment is about, and it shapes the way they respond. So in any case, when what we do is we'll ask questions when they show up to see whether or not they watched the news the night before. And if they did, we'll still let them participate in the experiment, but we just won't use their data when we try to analyze the effects of our experiment. So this is what happened for people who were assigned to group 1. They went in and they sat down and they were told that what they were watching was the evening news the night before. So when the evening news starts, the first report is a local crime story. Right after that, there's a report about some tornadoes that broke out in Oklahoma and did a lot of destruction. After that, there was a commercial. When they came back from the commercial, there were 3 reports having to do with the president's policies on terrorism. And if you see on the table that where it lists each of the reports, there's a plus sign and a minus sign before and after the president's policies on terrorism. What this is intended to denote is that there were favorable things and unfavorable things said about the president's policies, right? It was balanced, is how we call it. Critics and supporters of the president. Same thing, the second report that they watched on terrorism, some different part or aspect of terrorism, there was positive and negative things said about the president's policies on terrorism. And then a third report on terrorism as well. It was a big terrorism day for some reason. In any case, it was balanced, positive things and negative things said about the president's policies. Then there was a commercial. When they came back from the commercial, what they saw was a report on yoga as a way to reduce stress, followed that with a feel-good report about an 85-year-old grandmother who graduated from college. End of news. Now, people who were assigned to group 2, they never saw what group 1 saw. They had no idea that they were seeing something else. Everybody thought they were seeing the evening news. Well, when they sat down to watch the evening news, they saw the same local crime story that group 1 saw. They saw the same tornado story that group 1 saw, and the same commercial. But when it came back from the commercial, what they saw was balanced coverage, but it wasn't about terrorism. It was about the president's policies on the economy. And the plus and minus sign that you see denote that, once again, the coverage of the president's policies on the economy was balanced. So there was one report balanced on the president's policies on the economy, a second report that was balanced, both positive and negative, on the president's policies on the economy, a third report on the president's policies on the economy, right? And then a commercial. Then the same story about yoga as a way to reduce stress that they saw in group one. And then the 85-year-old feel-good story about the grandma graduating college that they saw in group one. And then that was the end. Now, one of the things they do, and we do in research, is that we ask participants in experiments to complete what's called a feeling thermometer. What a feeling thermometer is just basically this. Sometimes they'll literally show a thermometer and they'll ask students to tell us how you feel about the president. 100 means you feel very favorable or very warm towards the president. A 50 means you feel kind of cool, neither favorable nor unfavorable towards the president. And then a 0 means you feel very cold towards the president. So you can think of 100 as being very favorable, 50 as being neither favorable nor unfavorable, and 0 as being very unfavorable. So here's my question. Subject A. Will subject A, whoever that subject happens to be, will they give the president a high rating and a low rating? Well, it's hard to answer that question unless we know how subject A feels. So let's assume for the sake of discussion that subject A has very positive feelings about the president's policies on terrorism and very negative views of the president's policies on the economy. So the first thing you should know is that in order to tell whether subject A is going to give the president a high rating or a low rating, you need to know which group subject A was in, because that's going to affect your response. So let's assume, for the sake of this part of the discussion, that subject A was in group 1. Would subject A give the president a high rating or a low rating? Well, hopefully you said that they're going to give the president a high rating. And now, thinking in terms of the memory-based model, why would that be the case? Well, all they saw was reports on terrorism. They didn't even see anything about the economy. So they may have negative attitudes at the top of the head, maybe some in the back of the head about the economy, but they've just been seeing report after report after report on the president's policies on terrorism, and a lot of it was very favorable. So now that's all going to be at the top of their head. The negative stuff they saw on terrorism, well, they counter-argued and rejected that. So at the end, when they were asked to evaluate the president, they took a random sample of attitudes, mostly from the top of the head, not so much from the back of the head. And based on that, they gave the president a rating, and it was a very high rating because of all the positive things at the top of the head. Now, what if that same subject was in group 2? Would they give the president a high or a low rating? Now, keep in mind, they still like the president's policies on terrorism, but they don't like the president's policies on the economy. Would they give the president a high rating or a low rating? Hopefully, you said that the subject A, if they were in group 2, would give the president a low rating. And why would that be the case? Because they just watched 3 reports on the economy, right? Balanced reports that had positive and negative things about the economy. But this person doesn't like the president's policies on the economy. So every time he heard something negative, he's like, that's right, that's terrible, that's right. Every time he heard a positive thing about the president's policies on the economy, what did he do? He counter-argued. And so by the time the experiment was over, this person had all these negative things about the president's policies on the economy at the top of their head. So when asked to give the president a rating for the president on just overall, they do take a random sample of attitudes, mostly from the top of the head, not so much from the back of the head. And in this case, they give them a low rating because there's all these negative attitudes about the economy at the top of their head. But now here's the question. Did I just disprove my own argument? I mean, after all, the media showed positive things, in this experiment at least, about the president's policies on terrorism, and this person gave the president a high rating. In the second one, the media presumably showed a bunch of policies on the economy, and the president gave a low rating. And not the president gave a low rating, the subject gave him a low rating. In one, they gave him a high rating. The other, they gave him a low rating. I've been arguing that the media doesn't have much influence, and yet subject A went from giving, if subject A was in group 1, he'd give the president a high rating. If subject A was in group 2, he'd give the president a low rating. That seems to speak to the power of the media. Does it? I would suggest to you that it doesn't. Because when subject A went into group 1 and saw those news reports, he had a positive view of the president's policies on terrorism and a negative view on the economy. Well, what were subject A's views when he was done watching the reports in group 1? Exactly the same. The media didn't have any impact on what subject A thought. He walked in liking the president's policies on terrorism, not liking the president's policies on the economy, and when the experiment was over, he felt the same way. The media didn't have any impact on him. He started off feeling one way, he ended feeling the same way. And if subject A was in group 2, the same thing is true. He walked in having a positive view of the president's policies on terrorism, a bad view of the president's policies on the economy, and when the experiment was over, he felt the exact same way. The media didn't have any impact on this person at all. They just activated different things that this person already felt. They just brought different things to the top of his head, which is exactly what priming is. But the media didn't affect this person. This person's own views affected his, or I guess it could be her, responses. Well, what about somebody who's ambivalent? How would they have responded? Now, how would somebody who is ambivalent respond to be in this kind of a experiment? Now, keeping in mind that the news reports were balanced. In this case, I have subject B. And subject B I'm describing as having both positive and negative attitudes about the president's policies on terrorism and positive and negative attitudes about the president's policies on the economy. So this person is ambivalent. They have mixed feelings about the president. How would they have evaluated the president? Well, if subject B was in group 1, they would have seen a whole bunch of news coverage that had both positive and negative attitudes about the president's policies on terrorism. And we know people who are ambivalent don't counter-argue. So they're just going to get bombarded. They're going to hear some positive stuff, and they're going to be like, oh, that's cool. Negative stuff, like, oh, that's not cool. Positive stuff, oh, that's cool. Negative stuff, that's not cool. And they're going to go through that whole process. And by the time that experiment is over, are they going to give the president a high, a medium, or a low rating? Well, hopefully you said a medium rating, because they went in ambivalent. They were bombarded with both, or bombarded is a terrible word to use. They were exposed to a lot of positive and negative things about the president's policies on terrorism. They were ambivalent before. They walked out maybe even more ambivalent before, but they gave him a medium rating. And what about if subject B was in group 2? Would they give him a high rating or a low rating or a medium rating? I hope you wrote a medium rating, because it's going to be the same experience that they had in group 1. Now they've just seen a whole bunch of stories, both positive and negative, about the president's policies on the economy. And so they walked in ambivalent. They were exposed to positive and negative things about the president's policies on the economy. They were ambivalent going into the experiment. They were ambivalent coming out of the experience and the experiment. The media didn't have any impact on them at all. Does that mean the media has no impact on people? Well, no. If the news coverage had been overwhelmingly positive or overwhelmingly negative, since people who are ambivalent don't counter-argue, that probably would have shaped what was in the top of their head. You could argue that the media would then be shaping their attitudes. Now, how long those ideas would stay in the top of their head or back of their head, we don't know. But you could argue that if somebody who's ambivalent was watching news that only gave one side, they would in fact be affected by the media. And that's a reasonable thing to point out. But what I want you to keep in mind is that the universe of people who are affected by the media, and especially the media who's doing balanced coverage, starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, what about the media outlets that are biased, that aren't doing balanced coverage? I would submit to you that the people who go to those kind of news outlets oftentimes are univalent. They're not going to be affected by the media coverage anyways. People who are ambivalent usually don't pay as much attention to the news at all. And so it winds up being that as you think about how people consume the news and how people process information, the idea that the media is really, really powerful starts to look way more complicated. And that's really what I want you to walk away from this discussion thinking is, man, it's not quite as simple as I thought. Now, if you disagree, post something on the discussion board, and it will be fascinating to talk about this. And people can disagree. That's totally fine. That's one of the things I like most about politics, is being able to disagree, especially at this kind of like intellectual level where we're talking about information processing and all these kind of complicated, more nuanced things, rather than people who just yell back and forth at one another on a lot of these programs. I find that totally uninteresting, but these kind of disagreements over complex, nuanced understandings of the way people process information, I love this stuff.